Good evening. My name is Kyle Reebok, and on behalf of the 2018 Golden Apple Committee, thank you all for being here to recognize Professor Sandra Levitsky of the Sociology Department as the 28th winner of the Golden Apple Award. The Golden Apple Award has a long history of recognizing the university's most valuable professors. For those of you that may not be aware, the Golden Apple Award is the university's only teaching award that is bestowed on faculty members and is presented by students and by students alone. Many faculty members and past winners of the award view the Golden Apple as the most prestigious award a professor can receive, and it is my pleasure to present it to Professor Levitsky today. The roots of the award, however, extend much further back than the 28 years we have been presenting it at the University of Michigan. It was inspired by the teachings of a rabbi who 1900 years ago preached to, quote, "Get your life in order one day before you die." The Golden Apple Committee acknowledges professors that, by this lesson, give their all in the classroom every day, never knowing when any given lecture is their last. These professors truly understand the impact that their work has upon each and every student that they engage with, and this award is minuscule in comparison to the honor of being a part of their classrooms. Before we turn the mic over to Professor Levitsky, I would like to extend my thanks to several groups and individuals that helped make this event possible today. I would like to thank the Governing Board of Hillel, as well as our advisor Davey Rosen and our graphic designer Olivia Choi, who have continuously provided us the resources and advising to make this award possible. Their support and the support of Hillel itself is truly invaluable. I would also like to thank the departments that generously helped co-sponsor this event, the names of which are included in your program. I would also like to thank the hundreds of other professors that were nominated by students this year. While we can only present this award to one professor every year, the work that they do to enrich the university never goes unnoticed. I would like to thank Angels on Call, who put on an amazing free lecture show, and I'm excited to help them support Charity Music, which provides instruments and musical education to disadvantaged youths. I would like to thank the Sociology Department and its department chair, Karen Martin, who went above and beyond to spread the word of the event. When the committee surprised Professor Levitsky just a few weeks ago with the news of her win, we reached out to the department to see if any faculty or students would be available to participate in the surprise. When the committee arrived on the day of the surprise, we were thrilled to find a room full of people and colleagues that were proud and willing to make this surprise so memorable for us and for Professor Levitsky. Lastly, I would like to thank Ellie Benson, the marketing chair of the Golden Apple Committee, as well as the rest of the committee, for the months of fundraising, canvassing, and event planning that was put into organizing this event. Without each and every one of you, this never would have been able to be pulled off. Professor Levitsky is truly a wonderful example of a professor deserving of this award. When the committee surprised her regarding her win, I was able to hear a lot of heartfelt sentiments from her students and her peers that truly moved me. The work that she has done for SOL, or Sociology Opportunities for Undergraduate Students, has helped empower first-generation students to succeed not only in the classroom, but also professionally. Her research investigating social needs and inequalities is truly inspiring and impactful. Every year, the committee enables the winner of the award to donate to a charity of their choice, and Professor Levitsky has decided to contribute to the American Civil Liberties Union, an organization that works to protect individual and inalienable rights. As a future teacher myself, if my legacy inside and outside of the classroom can amount to even half of the legacy that Professor Levitsky has created for herself, then my career would be more successful than I can ever imagine. Today, we have the pleasure of witnessing what she would consider to be her ideal last lecture, entitled, quote, "Sociology and the Political Power of Optimism." So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage the winner of the 28th Golden Apple Award, Professor Sandra Levitsky.
Thank you. Am I amped? I am. All right. I am full of thanks. First of all, to my students, particularly those who not only endured my class, but then took the time to nominate me. I am so grateful. This award means the world to me. I have more to say to you in a minute. To my colleagues in sociology, who have collectively produced one of the most vibrant, interesting, relevant majors in the college, not to mention the top-ranked sociology graduate program in the country. It is an honor to be a part of your community. To my chair, Karen Martin, the first female chair in Michigan sociology's history. I have watched you and your commitment to undergraduate teaching since I arrived here as a postdoc 10 years ago, and I have tried in every way I can to emulate you. So thank you for being such a supportive mentor and role model during all these years. To my partner, Greta, whose irrepressible Midwestern optimism has sustained me for 20 years. We joke about how I get to teach all the sexy classes while you're in the trenches teaching social theory, but you are seriously one of the greatest teachers I have ever met, and that I get to enjoy an occasional impromptu lecture on Marx during dinner is a pleasure I wouldn't trade for the world. To my 7-year-old daughter, Esme, who will watch the intro to this talk on YouTube just to see if I mention her name. I get so much pleasure out of teaching you everything I can about everything, and then I keep unexpectedly discovering that you've been teaching me all along, and I want to thank you for that. My daughter asked me recently if I always wanted to be a teacher, to which I responded, no, I wanted to be a vet. I had big plans to be a vet. This is not at all what I plan to do with my life. But starting in my teens, I fell in love with words and their power to persuade, and I decided I wanted to be a lawyer. And in college, I was a political science and women's studies major, my first sort of sustained exposure to the study of inequality, and I honed my sights on being a civil rights lawyer in particular. But here is the critical fact about my college years. I disdained academia. I thought there is so much to do in the world, and here are these people sitting at their computers and reading their books and talking mostly to each other, and it all seems so ineffectual. But meanwhile, everyone in my family was a teacher. From elementary school teachers all the way up to college professors, everybody was a teacher. And so I fought that teaching gene by going to law school, and I took my disdain for academia with me when I went to law school. And when I got there, I promptly discovered that I wanted to be a teacher too. The story goes that after I won my law school's best brief competition, the dean of the law school asked if I would co-teach the first-year legal writing class, which is a required class, and it's a boring class. But it was my first time standing in front of a group of students as an instructor, and I absolutely loved it. And there were other things going on at the time. I was working part-time while I was in law school, and I realized that the questions that interested me most about the law, like why victims of discrimination are so reluctant to turn to the law for help, these are not actually questions that lawyers care about. They're interested in the people who do turn to the law for help. And so my questions were really questions that social scientists are interested in. So halfway through law school, I was confronted with the very real possibility that I might end up in academia. And remember, I disdained academia. And at this point, I had a conversation with my father, who is a college professor. And I think I was trying to persuade myself that academia, really wasn't all that bad. And I was saying things like, well, social science is really important for public policy, right? I mean, you can still make a big difference in the world with your research, right? And I remember there was this really long pause on the phone while my dad tried to figure out how to answer that. And he said to me, all academics hope to influence the world with their research. And some do, somewhat. But does our research actually influence the world as much as we hope? No, almost never. But he said, that doesn't mean that we lack influence. He said to me, every time you get in front of a lecture hall to teach, you have the opportunity to profoundly shape how your students see the world. You give them information. You give them ways of understanding that information. You teach them how to critique that information. You challenge them to come up with their own information, and then you send them off into the world and you let them loose to change the world. Hundreds of them every year, right? And that's where your influence lies. I took that very seriously, and I don't actually teach like it's going to be my last lecture. I teach like it's going to be your last lecture, and I have to give you everything I can before you get out. Tonight, though, I am supposed to deliver my last lecture. And what you might not know is that I am both a hypochondriac and superstitious. And So I have spent the last 3 weeks since learning about this award worrying that writing something called the last lecture was going to call some fatal diagnosis out of the ether. I have taken a lot of vitamin D. But when I think about actually giving my last lecture, I think about regret. Right? You don't want to leave the podium for the last time with any regrets. And I don't mean, a lecture that could have gone better or a student interaction that could have gone better. I'm talking about more fundamental teaching regrets. So I want to share one regret with you tonight in the hopes that I can put it right and leave it behind me when I get off the stage tonight. A couple years ago, I was teaching Social 100, Introduction to Sociology, and I had a conversation with one of my students at the end of the semester. She was a first-year student. She'd done brilliantly in the class, and so I said to her, as I do, you really should think about majoring in sociology. And she said to me, well, Professor Levitsky, I really loved the class, and I found everything we talked about really interesting, but it was just so depressing. I don't think I can take any more sociology classes. They are just too depressing. And I confess I found this stunning, right? How could she come away from my class feeling like sociology was too depressing? And I actually looked at the syllabus and I thought about what we'd covered that semester. And yeah, it was gender inequality, race inequality, class inequality, social institutions and the reproduction of inequality, the myth of the American dream, the disappearance of work, the failures of our education system. At the time, I didn't have a good response. It has actually taken me years to figure out not only how I should have responded to her, but how I should have communicated this to my class. Because if you peel back all of the depressing in sociology, our social science rests on a core of optimism. And I believe there is tremendous power in that optimism. And I'm not talking about emotional power or psychological power. I'm actually talking about real political power. So before I explain what I mean by that, let me just say I get the depressing. Right? On the first day of Social 100, I tell my class that studying sociology is like being given a very special pair of glasses to see the world around us. Right? It's a way of looking at those aspects of our lives that we totally take for granted. And we ask, how did they get to be like this? Right? Things we don't even notice anymore. How did they get to be like this? The sociological imagination, we learn, is what allows us to look beyond our personal troubles as individuals to see the larger social forces operating in and upon and around us. And those social forces are powerful, right? And they are durable. And it is their durability that can be so incredibly disheartening, right? So consider the following facts. In 1969, the rate of unemployment among Black Americans was twice the white unemployment rate. And 50 years later, it is still twice the white unemployment rate. Home ownership, which we conventionally understand to be a way, in a very important way, for working class and middle class families to build wealth, rates of home ownership remain unchanged for African Americans after 50 years. We have 1.5 million households in the United States today who live on just $2 per person per day. A kind of poverty so deep, it's hard to believe it actually exists in this country. And yet it includes 1 out of every 25 families with children. And importantly, that number is twice as high as it was just 2 decades ago. When I was in college many moons ago, the statistic we learned was that 1 in 5 women would be sexually assaulted while they were in college. That number remains unchanged nearly 30 years later. I hear these statistics and they are truly depressing, right? Nothing seems to change. Institutional racism and sexism, we learn, are embedded in the very structures of our society. Cultural stereotypes, we are told, are a learned part of our culture. Right? These are powerful social forces that shape our values and shape our choices and our paths in life. So I can see how they would make you feel frustrated. Right? I can see how they would make you feel helpless. But at the heart of sociology is a profound sense of optimism. Right? Because we know that what we observe in the social world is not inevitable. There is nothing natural about sexism or sexual violence. There is nothing natural about racial segregation. There is nothing natural about capitalism. Right? These are particular ways of organizing societies that could, under certain conditions, be arranged in some other way. And our work as sociologists is to figure out how. Right? So we study other cultures to see how other societies do things differently. We study other time periods to see that we used to do things differently. But all of this is to say that we believe fundamentally in the possibility of social change. Now, we study social change in a lot of different ways. I'm going to give you two examples to illustrate what I mean by this. One on racial disparities in our criminal justice system, and one on sexual harassment, both of which will sound vaguely familiar to those who have recently taken my Law and Society class. These are both really different examples, but they share an approach to studying difficult and persistent social problems in ways that shine a path forward. Right? And to be clear, people still have to take that path, and that is challenging political work. But at a time when it's hard to even see our way out, the first step is simply to light the path. So one way of studying social change is to understand what is driving a given social problem. Right? What is exacerbating it? Are there mechanisms that we can identify to break down those drivers and possibly reverse them? Right? So take the problem of racial disparities in our criminal justice system. The United States holds the world's record when it comes to incarcerating the most racial and ethnic minorities. Today, we imprison a larger percentage of our black population than South Africa did under apartheid. In some cities, including our nation's capital, 3 out of 4 young black men can expect to serve time in prison. The criminalization of the African American community is one area that has gotten worse over time. It hasn't even stayed the same over the past half century. It has gotten worse. And it is a particularly insidious problem because there is a self-reinforcing nature to it. Right? We know that racial stereotypes play a role in the criminalization of the black community, but locking up the black community only contributes to the stereotype that black people are criminals. So take driving while black. Right? We know that police stop black drivers at rates that far exceed police stops for white drivers. And I want you to actually picture what this looks like. When the police stop a black man and require him to stand in front of his car or sit in front of his car in handcuffs, while the officer searches that car, other drivers are watching this. Right? We stare at these scenes and we note, consciously or not, that it is a black man who is being searched and handcuffed and held by the side of the road. We don't have to know anything else about the motivation for that search. We don't need to know whether the police find something or not as they rummage through that car. We don't need to know if they let the guy go or arrest him. That scene alone reinforces the image of a criminal black man. Right? And it is in those everyday moments that cultural stereotypes are reinforced. Right? So this feels like one of those social problems that has no known cure. Right? How do you change a cultural stereotype? Things that are in people's heads. Right? Where do you even begin? Psychology has given us a great deal of knowledge about how stereotypes work. Right? What we know from psychology is that we all use stereotypes in our everyday thinking, and that this is normal, this is natural. Right? So stereotypes of people and groups help us to simplify the complex tasks involved in making sense of new information. We learn and we use these stereotypes as a sort of mental shortcut to make future encounters with similar situations easier to navigate. They are efficient for our brains, but they are not always accurate. Right? So we learn hundreds of these stereotypes as we grow up. Blondes are less intelligent, Southerners are less intelligent, guys are messy, guys are strong, girls can't throw, Asian Americans are bad drivers, Asian Americans are good at math, Jews are good with money, but Jews are tight with money, Muslims are terrorists. Right? The list just goes on. And the point is that we all learn these stereotypes. Stereotypes are part of the culture of any society, and if you are a living and breathing part of that society, then you have learned them too. In our culture, one of the most enduring racial stereotypes is that African Americans are more likely than other social groups to be violent, aggressive, and engage in crime. There is, in fact, consistent and robust evidence that every single one of us carries this implicit bias, including African Americans. So we can thank psychology for that information. But remember that what sociology does best is to see the connections between individual experiences and the larger social forces that shape those experiences. So we take that knowledge of individual bias and we situate it in the context of policy. And here we start to get some leverage on our impossible problem of racial disparities in the criminal justice system. What are the set of policy incentives that influence, for example, police decisions about who to pull over? It turns out that some policies can temper or constrain those cognitive biases, and some can activate them. The racial disparities that we observe in our criminal justice system are created in large part by a set of policies that activate those biases. Okay, so let me give you an example. We know that black drivers are pulled over at twice the rates of white drivers. It is easy to read that fact and think, well, that is racial stereotyping. But there's actually two kinds of stops that police officers rely on. There is the routine traffic safety stop, which is about enforcing the rules of the road, making sure that you are stopped at a red light, making sure you don't speed. And then there's the investigatory stop, sometimes called a pretext stop, which is a policing tool that has emerged out of the war on drugs. Investigatory stops are not about enforcing traffic safety, but are instead motivated by a desire to hunt for drugs. The hunt for drugs is itself structured by a set of policies that grant enormous financial rewards to police departments that focus their law enforcement efforts on drugs rather than other kinds of crime. So police officers use these minor traffic violations as an excuse or a pretext to search for drugs, a policing practice that has been approved by the United States Supreme Court. So how are police officers trained to do this? This is an excerpt from Charles Remsburg's Tactics for Criminal Patrol, which is one of the most common texts used by police agencies in this country. And in this textbook, we learn that police officers are taught to proceed through the following steps. First, develop suspicion, or typically merely curiosity about a driver. Discover a legal justification to stop that driver. Right? Typically, this is some minor violation of a traffic safety law or a vehicle code, and make the stop. Decide after making the stop whether to search the vehicle based on close observation of the vehicle and its contents, dialogue with the driver. This is why police officers talk to us when we get pulled over to assess our truthfulness. Search the vehicle, usually by consent. Discover contraband or weapons, make an arrest, and then seek bonus benefits, such as forfeiture of the car or cash or information about other criminal offenses. Regarding which drivers to pull over, Remsburg lists a number of factors that should awaken an officer's curiosity, including vehicle modifications, unusually dirty cars, unusual driving behaviors, and critically, drivers or vehicles that appear to be out of place. Right? The key thing to note here is the enormous amount of discretion that police officers have over who they see as suspicious. Who seems out of place? Is that a black man in a white neighborhood? Who seems out of place? Now, it turns out that police officers pick who they decide to stop very differently based on whether they are carrying out one of these routine traffic safety stops or an investigatory stop. Thanks to an amazing study by Charles Epp and his colleagues, we know that in traffic safety stops, police officers target especially egregious driving. In investigatory stops, officers target people who look suspicious. But here's the key fact. Racial biases do not kick in when making traffic safety stops, where the focus is on egregiously bad driving. But they are activated in the process of making investigatory stops, where the focus is who looks suspicious. Now, to make this argument, Epp and his colleagues dispense with some other alternative explanations for why black drivers are pulled over more than white drivers. One reason might be that they just keep violating the law more often, right? Epp and his colleagues find no evidence to support that hypothesis. And in fact, white drivers are slightly more likely to violate traffic safety laws. A second reason for racial disparities may not be about race, but about class. African Americans, on average, are poorer than white Americans, and being poor may translate into higher rates of stops because vehicles might have more problems, like broken taillights. or because police may be more suspicious of certain kinds or conditions of cars. Now, it is true that black drivers are operating vehicles that tend to have more code violations than white drivers, and they're driving cars that tend to be worth less money than white drivers. But Epp and his colleagues find that the role of these code violations in producing racial disparities is inconsequential compared to the other effects that they find. A third reason for racial disparities in police stops may have to do with these racial stereotypes we've been talking about. Police may view traffic law violations as more serious or more dangerous when they're done by a black driver compared to a white driver. But if that were the case, we would see racial disparities in all kinds of traffic stops. And that is not what Epp and his colleagues find. They find that in routine traffic stops, the most important influence on police is how people drive, not how they look. By contrast, in investigatory stops, the most important influence on who is stopped is not how they drive, but how they look. And what this tells us is that the structure of the policy and the police practices it produces play a key role in creating these racial disparities. When policies about traffic safety direct police officers to look for violations of the law, that's what they do, and they do so with virtually no racial bias. But when policies direct officers to look not for violations of the law, but for suspicious people, then they activate these cultural stereotypes about which neighborhoods and which people are suspicious. And that's when we see these dramatic racial disparities kick in. So one way of studying social change is to understand the drivers of social problems. It is true that racial stereotypes play a really important role in creating racial disparities, the disparities that we observe today in our criminal justice system. And it's hard to change cultural stereotypes. There is no getting around that fact. But policies also play a critical role in creating those disparities, and it's not as hard to change policies. Right? We are fully capable of designing policies that counteract rather than reinforce those stereotypes. Right? We are fully capable of designing policies that play to the best of our intentions rather than reinforce our worst. And findings like these point a way to that different path. But another way of studying social change is paradoxically to study the status quo. Right? How does it persist? Those statistics I rattled off about poverty rates or sexual violence, those are long-standing, durable patterns in our society that seem unchangeable. How do patterns of inequality persist over time and across generations? And critically, under what conditions can that status quo be disrupted? So take the problem of sexual harassment. Remember back in October when the New York Times published a story about decades of sexual harassment allegedly perpetrated by the American film producer Harvey Weinstein. And then dozens of actresses confirmed that story with their own stories of sexual violence. And as the media picked up these stories, the question kept being asked, if sexual harassment has been illegal for decades, why doesn't it disappear? How is it possible it is still this widespread? I was in college during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings when Anita Hill was called to testify before Congress about allegations that Thomas had sexually harassed her on the job. I cut class for 2 straight days to watch those hearings on TV. It was captivating. It was horrifying, but in a captivating kind of way. There was this sense that this problem that had no name, right? This problem that people were now calling sexual harassment was going to get some airtime, right? It was getting all this media attention. Women were watching this on TV and recognizing these experiences as something they themselves had experienced, and now they were being told they had a right to be free from that in the workplace. Workplace complaints started going up. Lawsuits started increasing. It really seemed like things were going to change. And I will be honest with you, the hardest thing about watching the Me Too movement explode over the past 6 months was realizing, in fact, that 30 years later, absolutely nothing had changed. Right? All of those stories that women were posting on Twitter or writing about in op-eds or talking about in interviews, those were the same damn stories. I know it's depressing again, right? But I'm asking you to think seriously about why things didn't change. Because if we can figure that piece out, then this moment we are in now could be transformative. Right? So let's go back to those news headlines of the first wave of men accused of sexual misconduct. There was Harvey Weinstein, film producer, Roger Ailes, chairman and top executive at Fox News, Bill O'Reilly of Fox News, Donald Trump, president of the United States, Roy Price, Amazon studio chief, Louis C.K., entertainer, Al Franken, United States senator, Matt Lauer, co-host of the Today Show, and Alex Kaczynski, U.S. Appeals Court judge. What do these men have in common? They're white. What else? What do white guys have? Power! It's always the answer in all my classes, power. The people accused of sexual misconduct over the past year are people with power. Superstar chefs and TV hosts, news editors, elected officials, professors. Now in sociology, we know that power works in different ways. In many cases involving sexual misconduct and employment, power is based on dependence. Right? The less powerful person needs a job, and that person needs the job more than the powerful person needs them. And that gives the powerful person a really important form of leverage to get employees to do things they might not otherwise do. But there are other more subtle dimensions to power that are at work here too. And one of these is the capacity of power to silence people. And I'm not talking a Stormy Daniels, shut people up with money kind of way. Right? In most cases involving discrimination and harassment, the perpetrator is acting in an authoritative role as a supervisor or a teacher or a boss. And people in these positions have the ability to enforce orders. They have more expertise. They have more resources. Their positions are often more secure than victims of discrimination. And what happens when people are in unequal positions of power is that you believe, and there is evidence to suggest that this belief is well-founded, you believe the system is going to protect the person with more power. And you can see this. You can see this in the willingness of companies like Fox or Uber or ABC News or Harvard University to ignore completely credible allegations in order to retain a perceived star. The pattern is so well established that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has given it a name. It calls it superstar harassment. Superstar harassers cast a long shadow. If it becomes known that someone at a high level is getting away with bad behavior, that sends a message down the ranks. It's useless to complain. It's useless to complain. And that is itself a form of silencing. Employees in unequal power relations also worry about retaliation if they were to speak up. Right? And again, fears of retaliation are empirically very well founded. Research tells us that it's actually very common for people who complain about sexual harassment to receive negative performance evaluations or be removed from their job duties or from specific projects or demoted or relocated. But regardless of whether it's fear of retaliation or disillusionment or cynicism that complaining won't do any good, the effect is the same. It's silence. Right? You experience the injury, but you say nothing. And that silence is like a blanket that covers everybody, not just the victim. All of the coworkers, all of the confidants, all of the people who know about the bad behavior but say and do nothing. Just a blanket of silence. Michelle Obama spoke about that silence in front of a New Hampshire audience not long after Trump's infamous Access Hollywood tape went public. She said it's like that sick, sinking feeling you get when you're walking down the street minding your own business and some guy yells out vulgar words about your body. Or you see that guy at work that stands just a little too close, stares a little too long, makes you feel uncomfortable in your own skin. We are drowning in it. And all of us are doing what women have always done. We're trying to keep our heads above water, just trying to get through it, trying to pretend like this doesn't really bother us. Maybe because we think admitting how much it hurts makes us as women look weak. Maybe we're afraid to be that vulnerable. Maybe we've grown accustomed to swallowing these emotions and staying quiet because we've seen that people often won't take our word over his. There's all kinds of reasons why people are deterred from speaking up, right? Why people remain silent even when they have suffered the very indignities that our civil rights laws were designed to prevent. But the point is that silence makes you feel like you are the only one. Silence makes you feel alone. And deep in that silence often is a sense of self-blame or shame. And what we know from sociology is that there are real political effects to that silence. Because when people feel ineffectual or disillusioned or powerless or ashamed, they withdraw from virtually all forms of political participation. So they don't voice their grievances at work, and they don't band together with other people who have the same problems, and they don't band together with other people who have the same needs. They don't turn to their elected representatives for help, and critically, they often don't vote. Silence maintains the status quo. Right? This political moment is about voice. Right? What happens when you break the silence? Sociology, remember, is about connecting individual problems to larger social forces. This is not just about you. This is not just your problem. This is a social problem. This is a structural problem. This is a shared problem. U.S. civil rights activist Charlie Cobb once said that part of the way that oppression works is that oppressors get people to believe that they are absolutely alone. And part of organizing, he says, is showing people that's not true. So one of the tactics that civil rights organizers used in the 1950s and 1960s was the mass meeting, right? Packing people into these small churches in the South for rallies and speeches and organizing. And one of the reasons they did that was to literally bring people together so they could see viscerally that their problems are not unique to them, right? That their problems are shared by all of the people packed into that church. That moment of seeing your connection to the larger picture can be deeply, profoundly empowering. I don't think Alyssa Milano knew what a sociologically important moment it was when she took to Twitter after that New York Times article and urged any women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted to write 2 words on Twitter: "Me too." If all of the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote "Me too" as a status, the actress wrote, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. Tens of thousands of people responded to her call. Right, so we moved from the church to the internet, but the effect was exactly the same. You could see it. You could follow it on your screen, the outpouring of people who shared the same experiences as you. Right? And that sense of being a part of something larger than yourself is how social movements are born. It's how they grow. And as the tweets rolled on, people asked, as they always do, well, if that really happened to you, why didn't you say anything? Right? But if you read the tweets, if you actually read the tweets, you see hundreds of reasons why women don't say anything, and those reasons don't change over time. Some said they feared for their jobs. Others felt like nothing would happen to their abuser. Some were certain they would be branded as liars or dismissed for just looking for attention. They are the same reasons as ever before, but what is different about this moment is the sound. This is not the sound of silence, this is the sound of voice, right? Angry voices, assertive voices, rightful voices, empowered voices. Harvey Weinstein was not felled by a single voice, he was felled by a movement. And each individual voice in that movement had to believe that her voice mattered. And that is absolutely an act of faith, but it is a politically powerful form of optimism. We have seen in the past year the collective power of voices knock down one powerful actor after another in entertainment and in politics and in the news media and in academia. It is an unleashing of voices that is decades in the making, and it doesn't stop with sexual violence. We are witnessing the same thing in the Black Lives Matter movement. We are witnessing the same thing in the incredible surge of activism around gun control. Right? We are in a moment right now when people are collectively, powerfully, optimistically giving voice, not just to change the story, but to change who gets to tell the story. And that is where we find social change. Now, we study the status quo in part to see how it can be disrupted. If silence is a means of maintaining the status quo, then how do we overcome silence? How do we overcome fear or shame or resignation? Right? This does not happen spontaneously. The students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School who have become the face of the gun control movement did not just spontaneously erupt in protest. They didn't just hit their limit and create the never again slogan. It is true they face the same old status quo. What happens each and every time there is a mass shooting in this country? Right? First, there is this combination of grief and horror and a great deal of press coverage. And then there is this moment when gun control reformers call for stricter laws, and gun control opponents offer thoughts and prayers but argue that gun control won't help. And then we all move on, and nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. But when Emma Gonzalez stood in front of a rally and chanted, "We call BS," she started a movement. So why these student voices? Right? Why are they so politically powerful? Right? These moments of activism feel spontaneous, but in sociology we know there is an organizing structure to successful movements. People need resources and organization and leadership. The Parkland students were unusual in the level of resources that they possessed. First, their school was incredibly well-resourced. Right? The median income in Parkland is twice what it is in the surrounding county, and their high school was a reflection of that wealth. Students in more affluent schools are more likely to learn about civic engagement in their classes. They are more likely to analyze current events and political issues in their classes. One Parkland student activist had just a few months ago completed a 50-page project on gun control for her AP Composition and Rhetoric class. That her school even has an AP Composition and Rhetoric class speaks volumes about the resources that these kids have as they prepare to be students, citizens. Right? The school has a theater program that teaches students persuasive communication and creativity and confidence, all skills we are seeing on display right now. So the school had resources that empowered its students. Their movement has been assisted by triple-digit donations from high-visibility figures like Oprah and George Clooney. And, not to be discounted, these students have been watching what happened over the past year as the Me Too movement has toppled one powerful figure after another. They have taken from that movement a profound and important lesson about political efficacy. Right? Their voices matter. Will they disrupt the status quo? Can they make that happen? I leave you with one last example of one of the most successful social movements in recent history to give you a sense of what political voice can do and the striking parallels to the political moment we are in today. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, the Centers for Disease Control began noting the incidence of unusual infections and aggressive cancers in otherwise healthy gay young men. And by the end of the year, there were about 300 of these reported cases of this very rapidly spreading disease. About half of those patients had already died within the first year. This was the start of the AIDS epidemic. The disease savaged queer communities around the country, and all levels of government at that time responded to the health crisis with just a deafening silence. Right? Nobody was acknowledging the existence of the disease. Drug therapies for AIDS were non-existent. The FDA and other government research agencies weren't even trying to develop drug therapies for AIDS. So people just died. They died by the thousands. And members of the queer community just went from funeral to funeral to funeral, and they held candlelight vigils and they grieved. AIDS was known then as a gay disease. It was talked about by the religious right as a punishment for being gay. No matter how out and proud the queer community was in the 1980s, that disease reawakened these old feelings of shame, right, and a profound fear. And the salience of that shame and that fear muted any desire for social protest. So instead of protest, The queer community took care of the sick, and they took care of the dying, and they memorialized the dead, and they quietly lobbied Congress to take action. And Congress did nothing. 5 years into the epidemic, the Supreme Court decision came down that dramatically changed the direction of the movement. In 1980, the Supreme Court upheld the state's right to criminalize same-sex activity in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick. Bowers versus Hardwick was experienced by the queer community and by the legal community as just an outrageously homophobic decision. And after years of frustration with the government's inaction in the face of this epidemic, the Supreme Court's decision changed the expectations for how the queer community should feel about the AIDS crisis. So instead of shame, the community began to feel indignation. Instead of fear, the queer community began to feel outrage. How could the United States government just obviously ignore the public health needs of its citizens? For the first time, it was clear that there were life-threatening consequences to state-sanctioned homophobia. But importantly, this dramatic shift in emotions did not happen by itself. Activists had to produce that shift in emotions. Activists had to manage that shift in emotions. And one of the primary ways they did this was by tapping into the staggering grief of the LGBT community. What activists from organizations like ACT UP did was to offer an alternative route for that activism, for that grief, activism. Right? Activists acknowledged the grief in the community, but they gave people a target for that grief, an explanation for that grief, a source for the grief. The government has ignored this epidemic. The government has done nothing to find a cure for this disease. And the government is letting people in our community die. If you feel grief, then you should feel anger towards those who have caused you to feel grief. And if you feel anger, you should join us in fighting those who are responsible for turning a public health issue into a massive nationwide epidemic. Or, as Larry Kramer, the founder of ACT UP, put it much more provocatively, 24 million gay men and lesbians in this country, and who is fighting back? How many dead brothers have to be piled up in a heap in front of your faces before you learn to fight back and scream and yell and demand and take some responsibility for your own lives? AIDS activist groups exploded around the country. Right? They relied on civil disobedience, and they relied on mass disruptions, and they organized die-ins, and they plastered our cities with guerrilla art and colorful protest theater. And all of this activism fundamentally transformed the politics of the AIDS crisis. It is not often that we can point to concrete, visible, unequivocal victories that come from activism, but this was one of those victories. They changed medical research protocols. They changed treatment protocols. They helped to develop new drug therapies. And importantly, they found a way to profoundly disrupt the status quo. This was an issue that nobody wanted to talk about. Right? This is an issue that nobody wanted to do anything about. It's an issue that terrified people into silence. But what activists did then, and what activists are doing now, is taking that grief and that fear and transforming it into political voice. One of the slogans of the ACT UP movement was silence equals death. Right? There are life-threatening consequences to government inaction. The high school activists who have taken up the battle for gun control are doing that same emotional work for our country right now, taking the grief and taking the fear of another mass shooting and transforming it into voice. But it takes people willing to believe, right? Even in the face of haters, even in the face of doubters, it takes people willing to believe that their voice matters. And that, again, is a politically powerful form of optimism. I am an optimist working in an optimistic discipline. But so much of my optimism comes from knowing what you are capable of. You have no idea how much power you have. Right? We, the older people who gave you a patronizing label like millennials and ascribe all kinds of unflattering characteristics to that label, We may dismiss what you have to say because you are inexperienced, or because you haven't lived enough, or suffered enough, or don't know enough. But as Tim Kreider wrote in a brilliant New York Times op-ed last month, the real reason we put you down is because we are afraid of you. We are all going to die, and you are going to take our place. In a closing paragraph in that op-ed that is as liberating as it is inspirational, Kreider says, "Go get us. Take us down. All those cringing provincials who still think climate change is a hoax, that being transgender is a fad, that socialism means purges and re-education camps, rid the world of all our outmoded opinions, prejudices, and rotten institutions, gender roles as disfiguring as foot binding, the moribund and vampiric two-party system, the savage theology of capitalism, rip it all to the ground. I, for one, can't wait till we're gone. I just wish I could live to see the world without us." I am grateful that this is not, in fact, my last lecture, because there is still so much to do. But take my optimism with you tonight and come back to sociology for more. Thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for this honor. Thank you.
Professor Levitsky, on behalf of all of your students and peers at the University of Michigan, the Golden Apple Committee, and the greater community of Michigan, I would love to present you with the 2018 Golden Apple Award. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.